You, so how was your week? And you told me in a word or two or a gesture, but now I'm asking all of you, how was your week? Who had a fantastic week?
Pretty good.
Yay. Who had an awful week? You can be honest, but if you didn't, that's fine too. But you know, we all have our highs and our lows, don't we? We and all who we know. So, seeing the pictures of the Amazon rainforest on fire and reading a report that Iceland actually had a funeral for a glacier that died were some of my low points this week. And yesterday, when I looked at Facebook, one of my colleagues had posted that she was at rock bottom. That's worrisome. So I prayed a lot for her yesterday, and I really hope she'll be okay. A young woman, 24 years old. Very capable, very intelligent. But I had a high point, or we had a high point this week too. And I asked Rod before I shared this whether I could. He got a job as a library assistant at the Fresno Central location this week. Yes, and that was a high point for us. Now, it probably didn't change the sort of the Richter scale on the global level, but for us, it made a real difference, and it was a high point. So thanks for rejoicing with us. Life has highs and lows. Good, really, really good, Renee, and really awful when we read some of the things that are happening. They distress and discourage us. Now, I remember last week when Judy read the scriptures for us, and I sensed that they were perplexing, and they were perplexing texts. And so I looked at this week's, and I thought, taken as a whole, looking at all of them, they're probably equally perplexing at points, although there were a lot of high points. So we're just going to dive right in. And it may seem like I'm kind of going from place to place, but I hope you can hang in there and follow the train of thought, and I'm hoping that it'll be helpful for all of us. So Psalm 103 that we read near the beginning as an invocation, you probably noticed there are sweeping statements about the goodness of God. And we're encouraged to bless the Lord. What does that mean? Call God holy. Give God praise for all of the things that God does. So what are some of those things? You might remember them just off the top of your head from hearing. Well, God forgives all your iniquities, heals all your diseases, redeems your life from the pit, crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, and satisfies you with good. God works justice for all who are oppressed. God is merciful, gracious, slow to anger. Steadfast love and compassion are extended towards those who fear God. And God remembers we are dust. Thank goodness somebody does. So that's a little bit about that psalm. When we look at that Psalm 58 text, I looked ahead or before that to the beginning of the chapter. This, what Renee read and what was given, is from verse 9 and beyond. But the first verses talk about some of the rituals. And Israel had its share of rituals. One of them was fasting. Okay, abstaining from food and drink, for spiritual development, spiritual growth, or possibly to gain favor with God. And that's possible too. But the prophet Isaiah says it's empty. That is, fasting without a proper attitude, a right attitude, and the right living is empty. He actually scolds them and says fasting is not for quarreling and fighting like you're doing. So maybe they were seeing it more as a competition, like who's the best faster. It was kind of before the, America's Got Talent type thing, but who's the best faster? So the prophet takes a very well-known religious practice and gives it a creative new twist. He says it's not about giving up and denying yourself in and of itself. What it has to do with is the right attitude and the right way of living. If that's not connected, it's not going to do any good. Now we might say, well, we know that, that's a given, self-evident. But how many times do we make decisions based on outward appearances or what's expected of us, or just, it kind of makes sense? Right? I do that. So that's where we can also look at it as. Isaiah then goes on to describe a real fast. This is what he says. You will call and God will answer. If you care for the hungry and afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness. You will know if or when you're truly fasting, if God guides you and satisfies you in the scorched places, when things are hard, when nothing seems to go right, when you feel spiritually dead. God will make your bones strong. You will be like a watered garden, like a spring of water. So those are elements connected with a real fast. I'm not sure whether you feel like you're in a scorched place or whether you feel like a watered garden. We feel both at some point in our lives, sometimes in the same week, maybe even in the same day. This scripture says, yes, we will feel those things. This is the human experience. Then the Hebrews text. In this passage, this writer recounts a much earlier time. He talks about when the Israelites were at Mount Sinai. And just to remind us, Moses was called up to the mountain. They couldn't even touch the mountain for fear of dying, they thought. Animals that touched the mountain needed to be stoned. We read that Moses went up in sheer terror. Just imagine that. The people themselves begged, God, please don't talk to us personally. Do that through Moses, because we're just going to die. Wow. That's what he recounts in Hebrews. But he says, that was then. This is now. So the now that's described is that we are not invited to something that cannot be touched, nor something that's blazing or destructive or heralding impending gloom and storm. In fact, we're invited to a party, a festal gathering it's called, because Jesus has mediated a new agreement. Talk about a 180, right? But then if you were listening really closely, no sooner has the writer said that about the party than he goes back to warning mode and says, but wait a minute. See to it that you don't reject the one who speaks to you. Who is that one? Jesus, who's throwing the party. The one who has mediated a new agreement. I felt a bit of whiplash when I read that. I thought, okay, wait, now, you talked about Moses and the mountain. You said, but now we don't have to fear, but see to it that you do it right. Because God is a consuming fire. How do you put that all together? Just hold that thought for a minute. Now the text from Luke 13, where Jesus speaks in a synagogue, has a different tone to it. One of the parishioners, so to speak, has been sick for 18 years. Bent over, can't look anyone in the eye, and probably people said, you're like this because of something you've done. So there was that added layer. But Jesus sees her and Jesus calls her. Just imagine that. A woman, and a woman with a disability to boot. A woman who's disabled. He calls to her. Wastes no time, heals her, she's walking straight. And then somebody objects. Wouldn't you know it? The religious leaders are upset and they voice their disapproval. Jesus wasn't following the rules. And just like the Israelites from the ancient texts knew about fasting, the religious leaders of Jesus' day really knew about rules. And one of them was, you cannot work on the Sabbath. Can't work. Well, what's interesting to me is that the rulers actually were angry with Jesus, but they addressed the people. Okay? They addressed the people and said, why don't you come on the other 6 days to be healed? There's plenty of time. So come then and be healed. Now imagine them telling you that, and you're going, oh, well, Jesus stepped in. And he doesn't mince words. He usually didn't. And he says, you hypocrites. Okay? You hypocrites. All of you have livestock. What do you do for your livestock on the Sabbath? You feed them. You make sure they're comfortable. If they fall in a well, you pull them out. So why would you begrudge this daughter of Abraham her health, even if she was healed on the Sabbath? So there too, he gives a different twist to that. In another passage, he said, the Sabbath is made to serve you, not you to serve the Sabbath. So it just flips it on its head. So what do we do with all of these diverse texts? And especially when they're given to us as reading for the same Sunday, kind of in a package. What is God like anyway? Who is this God? Do we think blazing, consuming fire? Are we intimidated with his stern warning that says, you watch out or else? Or do we identify more with Jesus who helps a person in need? They're hard questions. I wrestle with that. I always have, and I still do. What do you do with those disparate texts? I think all of us gravitate to what resonates with us. And definitely, speaking from myself, my personal experience, I gravitate to different texts at different times. So I have to say that the Psalm 103 text, where it lists all of the things God does, when I'm not feeling and experiencing that, not seeing it in my world, I have trouble reading that and saying, really? Like, I don't see that. So the first thing to help us is that we can't understand every text the same way, because they represent different periods of time, and they are different types of literature. Yes, they remain our sacred scriptures, but they have a different purpose. A little bit like the mom who yells, hey, get out of the street, you're going to get hit. But then she sings that nighttime lullaby. Different message, same mom. Scripture's like that too. Some of it is wisdom literature. Some of it contains regulations. Some of it is prophetic literature. In the New Testament, some of those letters represent teaching after Jesus was on earth. And then some tell stories, like the Gospels. Very different. So the first books of the Bible are law, or Torah, as the Jewish people call it. These are early writings reflecting how people understood and described God. These texts, just like all of Scripture, were given for a specific time and to a specific people in history. That doesn't say they have no bearing on us, but they were given for that time. And so the writer of Hebrews refers back to a story that happened at that time, that was given in that block of literature. The Psalms that we read is part of what's described as wisdom literature, poetry. So poetry is a snapshot. It's one place in time representing the feelings of that writer right at that time. And I just want to remind you, there are just as many let my enemies be damned psalms as there are bless the Lord psalms. They're all there, and they're all considered sacred, because we feel all of that at some point in time. So when things are going really well, sunny, wonderful, We gravitate towards those songs of bless the Lord, I'm so grateful, thank you. But when we're rock bottom, okay, then we're stumbling around and murmuring some of those other texts about despair and agony and gloom. Because that's where we are. All sacred places. Now the Isaiah text about appropriate fasting is found in the prophetic literature. The great UCC theologian Walter Brueggemann is one of the finest prophetic literature scholars, in my opinion at least. He says this about prophetic passages. The task of the prophetic message, the task is reframing so that we can re-experience the social realities that are right in front of us, but see them from a different angle. Okay, so that's what Isaiah did with fasting. Isaiah came at it from a different side and said, look at it this way. Just abstaining isn't going to get you anywhere. But right attitude, right living, that's what real fasting is. So prophets speak into a specific context and place in history as well. Isaiah did. And the prophets of our day do too. Prophecy isn't predicting the future. Prophecy is speaking truth to power. This puts the prophet on par, actually, with dissidents. People like Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, even the Dalai Lama, or someone like Elie Wiesel. If you observe and hear and read these types of works, you will notice a great deal of reframing, giving that experience a new twist so that we understand it for our time. Prophetic literature. I have to say that we, the hearers and the readers, sometimes have a hard time with prophets. Sometimes they're downright annoying. Sometimes they're really infuriating. But I would say that we depend on their voice for our social and our political and our spiritual survival. So we best listen. Hebrews is one of the many letters that are written for those who came after Jesus. So Jesus had lived and walked on this earth, and they were actually still trying to figure out how Jesus actually fit into all of this bulk of literature that you have in what we now call the Old Testament. Some of the letters, you'll notice, lean more heavily on the law, and some lean more heavily on Jesus and grace and embrace. Sometimes, like in Hebrews, they kind of collide, and they have both, and you think, okay, which is it? They're trying to figure it out because they thought they knew, as Israelites, what their Messiah was going to look like, and Jesus really didn't fit that stereotype. So they had to try to figure out, so what exactly did this mean? What was that message? What did he bring us? This helps us understand why one text like the one in Hebrews can describe God as a consuming fire, surrounded by dire warnings, and in the next breath, Jesus is presented as inviting us to a party. Okay? And then turning around and saying, but watch out. It reminds me a little bit about parents of teenagers, because I have been a parent of a teenager. They say, go on. Go to the party, have a great time, play a lot of games, have a lot of fun, eat a lot of food. Just don't forget who your family is, and don't you dare fill in the blanks. Right? Party, have a great time, but there's this side. That's what it reminded me of. I purposely left Luke for the last. Not because it happened last, but because the Gospels are pivotal. A big shift happened in the Gospels. Before that, was leading up to it. After that was trying to understand it and trying to live in accordance. But that shift happened in the Gospels. So this Luke passage of Jesus healing the woman with a disability is part of this storytelling gospel literature. The writers of the Gospels try to give us as much insight into Jesus' life and teachings as they can. This Jesus who is described as personally depicting who God is. The God of Luke 13 breaks barriers and norms, flies in the face of religious regulations. But God is not a lawless one, but God is a freeing one. A God who breaks in unexpected ways. A God who sees the least among us, like this woman who's been sick for 18 years. And last week, Gideon, who was called, but he described himself as the most insignificant person in the tribe that was the lowest. That's where God breaks in. Again, here's an example of Jesus presenting a very different picture of who God is than we see in the ancient texts of war and conquest. A prophet, speaking truth to power, I would say. So coming back to Walter Brueggemann, 2 books that he's written have meant a lot to me. One of them is called The Prophetic Imagination, and the other one is called The Practice of Prophetic Imagination. Okay? Just think about those titles. Not about what they mean, but think about the words. How many of you think about imagination when it comes to the faith journey? Imagination. I think we're more inclined to make dogmas and doctrines out of this mystical God who keeps almost shifting. We can't put our hands on God, really. But imagination. Imagination is a gift, and God expects us to use that gift. The biblical writers used imagination to bring us the colorful and nuanced, varied words of Scripture because of who God is. Beyond our comprehension, every human being who has ever lived, including the ones who've written the biblical text, had to use imagination because we have no clue what God is like. There's a lot of imagination going on. For us too, as we try to make sense out of God, out of faith, out of our experiences as individuals, in our families, in our church, in our schools, our community, and in our country and in our world. How do we make sense of all of that? Exactly like the biblical writers did, by using their imagination to depict the experiences and the struggles they had and trying to figure out, how does God speak into this? This is what it means when we say God is still speaking. When we understand the Scriptures in this way, we are freed up not to have the answers. We can have questions, even when, actually, mostly when we don't have the answers, we have that freedom. Freedom to embrace the various texts, the various sacred texts, just as we live in a wide variety and range of experiences ourselves. So I want to encourage us to carry that with us. The scriptural body that we have is varied, very many different types of literature, different periods of time, but in every one of them, it was people like you and me trying to figure out, who is this God and how do I follow God faithfully? God is still speaking. I hope that can help us a little bit. When scriptures perplex us, they will perplex us. We're human, after all. But to also remember that we can embrace our imagination because God is still speaking. Amen. Let's stand together if we can and sing.